I know it might be hard for you to imagine, but once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, I was your age. In my senior year in high school, I gave my heart to a wonderful girl named Galen. And in college, 2 years later, in the midst of what I thought was a great relationship, we actually had talked about getting married after college. She ended that relationship suddenly. It's kind of like today's equivalent of checking into Facebook and finding you're no longer a fiancé, but have in fact been defriended. Ooh. My pride was wounded, and that wound lasted for years. But looking back over 42 years of terrific marriage to my wife, Kirby, I see that God saved me from a relationship that would probably not have been good for myself or for Galen. You could probably hear the old Garth Brooks song in the background. I thank God for unanswered prayers. God healed my wounds through Kirby's love, through becoming a Christian, and through eventually being able to forgive Galen. At the time, I thought that rejection might be the hardest thing I might ever have to forgive. But life tests us. I have had to face other hard-to-forgive events, like my father's alcoholism, my mother's brutal murder, and myself after failing to help my brother avoid suicide. And yet with all these tests, I still see life not as a series of painful hurts to overcome, but as a love story with Jesus, with Kirby, with my children and my friends. And life is a never-ending adventure of trying to help others find that same love story. The main theme of that love story is forgiveness. When we experience it, we can pass it on. As Chris Tomlin sings, I'm forgiven because you were forsaken. I'm accepted. You were condemned. I'm alive and well. Your spirit is within me because you died and rose again. Amazing love. How can it be that you, my King, should die for me? As a Christian, the biggest blessing of my life is that I am forgiven. And it's my joy to honor the King of Kings, Jesus, by passing that love story on to others. Here's some of the ways that I've tried to pass this amazing love of forgiveness to others. In the next few minutes, I can only give you really the Wikipedia outline of the story, but my prayer is that you can live your own story of forgiveness and experience total healing from the hurts that you might already have lived through and those that you probably will live through in the future. We all experience injustices, and we keep an ongoing tally of how much an injustice has harmed us. If somebody hurts my feelings, I feel maybe this much injustice. If I go to the offender and say, why did you do this? And the person says, hey, life is full of little disappointments. What happens to my forgiveness? My injustice? It grows. We keep this ongoing tally. But if that person says, oh, I am so sorry, falls down on his face, wails, throws up, begs for my forgiveness, that makes the wound easier to bear. Even if the offender admits his or her guilt and very sincerely apologizes, makes restitution, and swears that he or she will never, ever, ever, ever do it again, like ever. even if the person says it swiftly. Now, note the alternative to this. A Facebook video went viral in February of 2012. A 15-year-old high school girl posted a swearing rant against her parents. The father discovered this, some of y'all may have seen it, and posted his own Facebook swearing rant against his daughter. And at the end of it, concluded by dramatically drawing his gun and shooting his daughter's laptop multiple times. His act shows where his daughter learned her disrespectful behavior. He passed along a gift to his daughter. It was a bad gift, and it will perpetuate bitterness in that family. Forgiveness, however, is a gift that you can give, a gift that changes things for good and not for bad. Now, forgiveness is actually two different experiences. We can make a decision to forgive, which is, I believe, what Jesus calls for in Matthew 6:13 and 14, when he says, "For if you don't forgive the sins against you, your Father in heaven won't forgive you. But if you do forgive others, your Father will forgive you." This decision to forgive is to give up ideas of paying the other person back and to decide to treat that person as a valuable person made in God's image. But we can make a sincere, lifelong decision to forgive and still feel unforgiving. Emotional forgiveness is replacing negative, unforgiving emotions like resentment and bitterness, hate, anger, anxiety, by positive emotions toward the person like empathy, sympathy, compassion, and love for that person who has temporarily made himself or herself our enemy. To forgive is human. Christians and non-Christians can forgive. But for the Christian, God works this forgiveness in us in cooperation with us. If I want to build a pillar of concrete all the way to the ceiling, I don't bring some concrete trucks in and have them dump concrete in the middle of the floor and then try to will it into a pillar. Instead, I build a pillar-shaped form out of, say, wood. And then I pour the concrete within that form, and when it hardens, I can take the form away and use it to build other pillars elsewhere. It's the pillar that lasts, not the planks. Forgiveness in Christians is God pouring solid, concrete forgiveness to build a permanent change in our lives. What I'm going to do is to describe for you 5 planks that make this form that can help us reach emotional forgiveness. They aren't a magic bullet, just temporary forms to guide God's forgiveness into our heart. It's God working the work of forgiveness that makes the lasting change. So I use the word reach. Reach is an acrostic for each of the steps on the way to emotional forgiveness. We can make a decision to forgive and act differently toward the offender, and then we use these 5 planks to build a form into which God pours emotional forgiveness. So what are the planks? R, it's going to make reach. R is to recall the hurt. We have to recall the hurt differently than we've been recalling the hurt. We may have been recalling what a jerk the person was to hurt us, or how much we've been victimized and damaged, we now have to recall that hurt differently. We recall it so that we can emotionally replace the negative with the positive emotions. We replace resentment and bitterness with empathy and sympathy and compassion and love for the offender. We see the person differently through the goggles of Christian love. That takes a long while usually, but it can be done, I believe, with prayer and effort. Eventually, we can give an altruistic, unselfish gift of forgiveness, an altruistic gift of forgiveness to the offender. The offender doesn't deserve our forgiveness, but we give that undeserved gift anyway. Importantly, even though we may decide to forgive and emotionally forgive, that does not mean we will necessarily reconcile with the person who hurt us, because that requires mutual trustworthiness, and the person may not be trustworthy. We might develop empathy, sympathy, compassion, for example, by having, say, an empty chair conversation with the person who hurt us. We imagine the person is in a chair. We pour out our heart to that person. We get over in that person's chair. We talk from their point of view, and we have this conversation. This helps us understand what the other person was going through. R, recall the hurt. E, emotionally replace the negative with the positive. A, altruistic gift of forgiveness. C, commit to the emotional forgiveness that we've experienced. We can tell others that we've forgiven, or we can simply write a note to ourselves that we've forgiven the person. I forgot. What does R mean? Recall to her. What's E? Emotionally replace the negative with positive. A, altruistic gift. C, commit to the forgiveness we've experienced. And we do that so that H, we can hold on to that forgiveness whenever we doubt, and we likely will doubt. This can be applied to forgiving ourselves as well. Rodrigo Mendoza enslaved the Guarani natives in South America. His true story is told in a movie called The Mission. After Mendoza killed his brother, he repented of his slaving, but he was consumed by guilt and shame. A Jesuit priest challenged Mendoza to return to the Guarani natives to help build a mission for them and thus work his way out of the shame. In one of the most poignant 10-minute scenes ever filmed, Mendoza, played by De Niro, trailed the Jesuits up the mountain, dragging his guilt and shame behind him in the form of a 100-pound bag of Spanish armor. They slogged through rushing streams, through almost impassable jungle, over boulders, up steep inclines and sheer cliffs. Mendoza was trying to do penance that would close a gaping injustice gap. When they reached the Guarani tribe from which he had taken slaves, Mendoza struggled up that last incline at the end of his reserves. His penance, he knew, had not been enough. He tumbled to his knees, the weight anchoring him to the earth. And worse, the Guarani natives realized that this bedraggled shell of a man was the slave trader who had taken away their families. a knife-wielding native ran at Mendoza, who awaited with fatalistic surety his deserved slaughter. The native grabbed Mendoza by the hair, jerked his neck back, and raised the knife. He looked over at the chief, and the chief went like this. And the native cut the cord that hung from Mendoza's neck, allowing the armor to tumble down a waterfall and be washed away. Mendoza wept. Loud, racking, rasping sobs signified freedom from his self-condemnation. Neither his penance nor the threat of death could set him free, but grace and mercy freed and changed him. From that point on, he worked diligently to help build the Guarani's mission, and later, when the mission was attacked, to defend it with his life. In my book that I've just written, will come out later this year, called Moving Forward, 6 Steps to Forgiving Yourself and Breaking Free from the Past, I work through 6 steps that when we know that we are a perpetrator, when we have hurt somebody, that we can go through to reach self-forgiveness. Step 1 is to go to God and receive God's forgiveness. We can't just haul off and forgive ourselves. We go to God first. Step 2, we may have been forgiven by God, but we still have not taken care of the social consequences of what we did. So we have to go to the other person and repair relationships. Step 3, we need to reduce the rumination. We need to repair our psychological damage from harming others. That brings us to a place where we can reach emotional self-forgiveness. We can apply those same 5 steps to ourselves. That's not the end. We also then need to realize self-acceptance. I may be able to forgive myself for doing something terrible, but it's often harder to accept myself as someone who would do something so terrible. And step 6 is to resolve to live virtuously. The basis of this approach is that we can't just haul off and forgive ourselves when we do wrong. We have to be responsible to God, to others, to repair social injuries, and to ourselves, working towards psychological wholeness before we can even consider to forgive ourselves. So how does this model work in real life? Well, on New Year's Eve in 1995, a young man invaded the home of my 78-year-old mother, probably thinking no one was home because it was New Year's Eve. The house was dark. My mother didn't drive. She had gone to bed early, so the house looked deserted. When she came out of her bedroom and confronted the young man, he bludgeoned her to death with a crowbar, and then, angry that his perfect crime had been spoiled, he violated her with a wine bottle. I was absolutely consumed with anger. I recall being in my brother's back room and talking with Mike and my sister Kathy, and in a fury, pointing to a baseball bat against the wall and saying, I wish whoever did that were here. I would beat his brains out. Later, I worked through forgiveness using that reach forgiveness model. I considered how a teen might be feeling, crouched out in front of a house, contemplating burglary. He probably thought this is going to be a perfect crime. These people are going to a New Year's Eve party. I'm going to waltz in there. I'm going to take all their valuables. I'll be gone long before there's any danger. It was a good conclusion, but it was based on faulty information, and my mom was home. He broke in, and when Mama awakened and confronted him, he must have looked at her in shock. He must have thought, this old woman is spoiling my perfect crime. And then he probably looked at her and thought, she's seeing my face. I'm going to go to jail. He's got a crowbar in his hand that he used to break the window to get in. He's got an impulse control problem, and he reaches out and he hits her. She falls. He hits her again. She turns, hits her again. And that was the blow that probably was responsible for her death. And then he violated her. And then she lay there on the carpet with blood flowing from her head and her hips. In the bedroom where I sat, trying to imagine what this crime might have been like from the point of view of the person who did it, I suddenly flashed back to seeing myself standing in that back room and pointing to that baseball bat and saying, I wish whoever did that were here. I would take that baseball bat, I would hit him in the head until he died. I thought, whose heart is darker? Is it this kid with an impulse control problem whose perfect crime is spoiled? Or is it this, at that time, 48-year-old Christian psychologist who teaches people about forgiveness, who studies forgiveness, but who wouldn't even, until that time, allow the F word to enter his mind? And I knew that my heart was darker than that young man's. And yet I knew also that if I confessed my sin, I could be forgiven. And I thought, if I can be forgiven for my darkness of heart, who am I to hold this against this young man? And I was able to forgive, and it stuck. We have the awesome privilege of admitting our own wrongdoing and being cleansed of all unrighteousness. But we also have to have an awesome responsibility of turning people who have sinned against us and those we love over to the living God who deals with them in perfect restorative justice and mercy and forgiveness. Of course, stories like this don't really end, and in 2005, almost 10 years later, my brother committed suicide. He had been racked by depression and post-traumatic stress disorder for over 9 years after discovering my mom's murdered body. I was able to follow those 6 steps I mentioned to self-forgiveness and forgive myself for my blatant failure to help him when he asked for help. I took my failures to God. I helped repair the damage by getting Mike's finances organized after his death. I dealt with my own sense of perfectionistic expectations, and then I could reach self-forgiveness by working through those same steps that we forgive others by, to forgive myself. And now I'm trying to help others deal with their self-condemnation. What we receive, we pass along. Forgiveness is a blessing from God. I've briefly explained what it is. I've described specifically how to move through the 5 steps to reach forgiveness for others and yourself. Forgiveness is a gift we receive from God, and we can pass that gift along to others to transform their lives, their families, and their entire countries. You can pass along that gift to those who have injured you. I am no super forgiver. I once held a grudge against a professor who gave me a B, imagine that, for 10 years. And it took a religious experience to get over it. But know this, if I can forgive something as severe as my mother's brutal murder and my own failures in failing to help my brother commit suicide, then you can also forgive those terrible things that have been done to you and by God's grace.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.